I thought I would start out by telling you why molecules are like nanomaterials, and then I'll kind of follow up by telling you why nanomaterials are not like molecules at all. The main reason is that the scale of molecules is pretty similar to the scale of nanomaterials, so they show similar behaviors. And that's just a direct consequence of the types of forces that are acting on both particles. So the loss of the effect of gravity means that we can get these stable colloidal particles in aerosol suspensions. Then the same kinds of forces that can act between molecules to give rise to environmental transport, adsorption, and aggregation, that can also occur with nanoparticles and nanometer scale materials. And then lastly, there's a lot of chemical reactions that occur using nanomaterials as the substrate. And of course, one important difference between molecules and nanoparticles is that the reactivity occurs primarily at the surface of the particle, because that's the area that's exposed to the environment. Nanoparticles also, at small sizes, begin to show quantum effects, again, like molecules. Unlike molecules, those quantum effects can be tuned by tuning the size of the particle. Okay, so now I want to talk about why nanomaterials are not like molecules. So in this case, when you have a simple molecule like a benzene molecule, all benzene molecules are basically identical to all other benzene molecules. But when you have nanoparticles, it's kind of a different case. It's like snowflakes. Every nanoparticle is slightly different from every other nanoparticle. So this very high degree of heterogeneity makes nanomaterials more like polymers than like pure molecules. And in particular, the structure and reactivity of the nanoparticle depends on its history. So effects like the residual presence of catalysts in carbon nanotubes and the history of how a sample is prepared are going to affect the dimensions of core shell structures, for example. Here, the nanomaterials act like molecules because they're similar size to molecules, so there's some similar behaviors, but they're also heterogeneous, and so you can get both variations in the properties, and also there's some really big analytical challenges, which I hope we're going to hear more about during the meeting. And then I also want to stress that nanomaterials are already out there and being used in consumer products.
It's my pleasure to be here. Dr. Lieberman started to build the bridge from the scientific shore. I'm going to try to build the bridge from the legal shore. In the next 40 minutes, we're going to try to give a legal primer for the issues of regulation. And we're going to try to cover really three basic themes, or three subjects in this. The first is a high-level overview of regulatory theory and regulatory approaches, kind of the toolbox. How can we regulate, when, those kinds of things. Spend some time on definitions, because those are critical to lawyers, and then a very high-level view of current regulatory structures that may have some applicability to nanotechnology. If you tell my world we need to regulate, we've got to do a couple of things. We've got to define the item or the activity to be regulated. I'm going to spend some time on this. I'll give you a hint here. Scientific definitions often don't meet the needs that we have in my world for legal requirements. Who's going to regulate it? State, local, federal, centralized, decentralized, a new agency divided up among existing agencies. And by the way, there are people that have advocated creating a federal agency for nanotechnology. Right? Then what's your regulatory approach? Hard to soft, some terms I'll use in a bit. Is it pre-market? Is it post-market? What's the role of the consumer and patient in terms of autonomy and choice? The law lags science. You're always ahead of us. It's the nature of the beast, right? So part of our challenge is when and how do we react to the new stuff you come up with? Now, that's Regulatory Theory 101. Should we regulate it? What is it we want to regulate? How do we want to regulate it? Okay. The first step, once we pass the initial point of should we do something, is we got to define it. Right? So we must define nanotechnology if we're going to regulate it. There's no agreed upon definition. These are 3 definitions pulled from reputable sources: National Nanotech Initiative, European Commission, Friends of the Earth, and they're all different. And by the way, even if you want to pick one of these, I'll show you in a second, none of these are at all adequate for people like me. Right? So, understand that the legal regulatory oversight is the end result of a policy debate that hopefully you'll play a role in. We can screw this up by over-regulating or under-regulating, and the key issues that we face here are definitional issues, testing issues, labeling, risk identification, and benefit.
Here's a quick plan of the talk that I'm going to provide, and in, I guess, the metaphor of the moment, the place where I root myself is probably a bit closer to the legal coast than to the scientific coast in this bridge that we're building. But what I want to describe are the activities of, and particularly the strategic vision of, the Center for Nanotechnology and Society at Arizona State University, which is a bridge-building enterprise in and of itself. In talking about anticipatory governance, we first want to focus on this concept of anticipation. And you can see from the sort of the etymology given here that anticipation is really about an early capacity building rather than, for example, something that has to do with expectations, predictions, or foresight, although sometimes I will use that term interchangeably. When we talk about anticipation, we talk not about trying to understand what will happen in the future, but talking about a preparation for the multiplicity of things that could happen in the future. We often think about how to control, in the laboratory experimental sense, the material that goes outside of the laboratory. And I would argue here that what we also need to do is think about, because laboratories are social and precautionary, what if we expanded the social and precautionary elements that go on in the laboratory as a way of thinking about governing emerging technologies like nano? Let citizens have anticipatory, engaged, and integrative experience with emerging technologies and protect them as we do the scientists.
You know, one of the things that we haven't yet talked about that is part of the regulatory process that was up on the slide of that big space between doing and banning is the process of creating standards.
I mean, does the public really want to sit there and debate, is it, 4 parts per million or 5 parts per million, or is the fundamental function of public engagement to give people confidence that the decision makers have their best interest at heart?
I mean, science seeks certainty, but when you have something, a decision has to be made, you often are making the decision on incomplete or incorrect information. And then when more complete picture emerges, then the scientific community feels like it's been accused of flip-flopping, as if there were something wrong with changing your mind based on new evidence.
If you think about what the situation is with nanotechnology, where, look back at EPA and the chemicals that we've got. There are still, 60,000 pesticides for which we don't have a risk assessment. It's 80,000 now. Okay, so sorry. We're not going to have the risk assessments for these things. What else can we do?
When you look at nano in a broader context, how does this fit in terms of risk, relative risk, whatever, with other things in society? And is this an area where we should or should not be focusing time and resources if you want to look at broad public benefit, public health questions?
That it seems sensible to look particularly hard at materials that are providing large doses to the public, which right now is probably nothing yet, but coming down the pike, maybe carbon nanotubes as those materials, those bats degrade. Anyway, that the poison is in the dose for toxicological purposes. So, yeah, it's a matter of resources. There are hundreds of millions of chemical compounds, and some of them are pretty nasty, but they're in the hood. They're not out in the neighborhood.